As a young man growing up in New Hampshire, I had the great fortune of living just down the street from my granddad, who had a basement full of woodworking equipment. You can imagine I probably spent quite a few hours there as a youngster. Anyway, one of my favorite possessions from my granddad is this little knick-knack shelf. It's probably over 60 years old. I wish he had signed and dated it, but nevertheless, it dates back to the early 50s for sure. Well, later in my life, when I got into woodworking, I had to make something like this, and I made this little knick-knack shelf out of some simple pine boards. And then later, still in the early 90s, when I got involved with lathe work, I made some shelf units as well. This lesson is based on this from my granddad, which is probably based on projects that people did hundreds of years ago. As with most projects, it starts by milling the material. I want to know what I'm going to be working with. Here I've taken quite a few pieces of bird's eye maple. I've got nice flat smooth surfaces with a nice straight edge on one side, and they measure probably just a little under 7/8 of an inch thick. Well, based on my material, I'll then go to my paper and pencil and do a design for this set of shelves. So I've taken my boards, my material, and I've ripped a strip off to use as a gauge to do my blueprint. I've just used a stick of this wood, a smidgen narrower than my wood here, because I'll have some loss in leveling, flattening the rings. And I've put a series of parallel lines up through here, representing each one of my rings. I've shaped these 3 vessel forms, and when this project is done, each one of these round vessel forms is going to get cut apart. I'll make one set of shelves using half pieces, and I'll make 2 corner sets of shelves using quarter pieces. You'll see that later in the project. But for the designing, it's pretty basic. It's just a whole series of stacked rings. I've numbered all the rings, A, B, and C vessels. They're really not going to be vessels, but we'll call them vessels. I've recorded my diameters on each ring, and then I've gone and to Excel on my computer, and I've transferred all these diameters over to the ring diameters here, and I've created this worksheet, if you will, this cutting list. And of course, what we really need is these segment lengths to produce all these rings. This is all pretty basic stuff that you've seen in my previous DVDs, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this portion of this particular project or lesson. With all my lumber prepared, it's all got a nice straight edge on one edge, so I can go to my table saw. I can rip my various widths, cut my segments, and start building rings to build these 3 vessel forms. If you'd like to use my plans, my dimensions, feel free. I'll show you 3 close-ups of these 3 vessel forms. You can record the information or maybe take a screenshot, proceed accordingly, and I'll show you a close-up view of that Excel spreadsheet. Again, you can design your own or use these dimensions, totally up to you. Notice that I've designed these vessel forms with a very thick, over 1/2 inch wall thickness. That comes into play later on. You'll see why I did that. So now it's just a routine matter of cutting a lot of segments, going from my blueprint, creating these rings from my bird's eye maple segments. Just going down through my blueprint and cutting all the segments necessary for each ring, using the half ring technique with a little spacer, that little gap, designed to absorb any error. Then putting the half rings together. Here I've got the luxury of a large 20-inch disc sander, but you can do this without a 20-inch disc sander. Use a 12-inch. And one thing I do a lot of, especially as rings get bigger, I'll use a sanding board here, just a fence, real straight piece of hardwood with 80 grit sandpaper. This does the final, tune-up of those edges, those surfaces, just to get them to fit perfectly. No light comes through. I've also marked the location of where the half rings go together. That'll allow me, when I stack these, to keep that particular part of each ring in the same general location. Just in case the rings came out a tiny bit oval, well, I'll be stacking them all up, matching each other, and I'll have an easier time of matching the vertical seams. So now these rings have all been put together. I'm not going to show the various steps of assembling, stacking, and rough turning these three forms. I think you're probably pretty familiar with that. If you're not, perhaps you should review one of the earlier DVDs. I will show the construction of the top ring with all the veneer layers. I'm using fairly thick veneer. This measures a strong 1/16 of an inch thick. I've got 16 strips here, all squeezed together and held together by this masking tape. Now I can gang cut 16 segments of veneer in one cut. I've done some testing ahead of time with MDF to make sure I've got the right size. I'm using blue painter's tape. This tape comes in different types of stickiness. You want the easiest release style. Otherwise, you'll risk tearing veneer fibers away from the veneer when you remove the tape. So I'm taping together half rings, just very carefully, squeezing those seams together and holding them with tape. And as you might guess, they don't come out exactly perfect, but just a very light touch of the disc sander, with the disc sander just on coast. Now you could do this manually as well, but just a little touch up here on the disc sander allows me to tape these together into perfect 16 seams. Now to glue this together, first I need a smooth surface, of course, on my ring. So I've done that with the disc sander. I've got another disc of NBF. I'm covering it with a piece of rubber rotor pad, about 1/8 of an inch thick. And on top of that, I'll just put some wax paper, then I'll lay down my ring. The purpose of the rubber pad is to apply more even pressure. Veneers are notorious for not being exactly the same thickness, and by having that rubber pad underneath there, I feel it gives me a better application of pressure against the veneer. It sucks up any unequal surfaces. So plenty of glue here, just like gluing anything else together. Nice bead of glue all the way around. I'll apply it on the ring here first, and then the veneer, spread it, and more or less bricklay the assembly. It doesn't have to be exactly in the middle of the other seams, because you'll never see these black seams. Spreading the glue on both surfaces. I'm showing this in real time. Of course, I won't show every ring glue job, but I want to give you a sense of what's involved and what it takes to glue these fragile veneer rings and get nice tight seams with veneer. It is not quite as easy as just slapping together flat surfaces of segmented rings. The rubber pad, I feel, really is important. You might get away without it from time to time, but eventually you're going to have a fat seam there somewhere where you just were not able to get pressure on that veneer. So take the time to use the rubber pad. I think you'll be happier with the results. Now it may appear that I'm using a lot of glue. I'm putting a nice thick coat on both surfaces, but I feel it's important. It gives me more time to align things. Glue's pretty cheap, so I'm not worried about the expense. I'd rather have too much glue than not enough. Also, this veneer is pretty soft, pretty porous. It'll soak up a lot of glue. So I'm taking my time getting things aligned on my other plate of the other disc that's underneath there, making sure I've got a surface to support my clamps in the right place. And I'll put a few clamps on, I'll check my positioning, make sure everything's centered, nothing slipped out of place. And again, because I've got that rubber pad, I want a lot of pressure. I'm going to put these clamps, probably about every 2 inches around the perimeter of this. And these clamps are very, very stiff. They take all my strength to open them this 1.5 inches, 1 3/4. They apply a lot of pressure, especially when this many are applied to a surface like this. I've waited at least 3 hours. I wait a little longer when I'm gluing veneers together. They tend to curl on you if you don't keep them under pressure for a little longer period of time as compared to just stacking rings. And on that blue tape, make sure you use the style of tape that has the easiest release. That tape comes in various stickiness. Getting it ready to glue on, well, in my case with a 20-inch disc sander, it's just a brief touch-up on the sander. The sander's just coasting. It's not an aggressive sanding. If you don't have the luxury of that big sander, then a disc of MDF. It's got a center hole that works with the screw chuck. A bead of hot melt glue secures the disc very centered to that centered hole. Once this has been secured, I can just screw it on. Make sure you let that glue set up. Don't get your fingers in that hot glue. So for flattening this, it just takes a few seconds with my 80 grit sanding block. Run your finger around, make sure there's no ridges. I put a very healthy bead of glue on there. I did a dry fit previously, positioned my tape. I just rotated that around to spread the glue. These quick clamps come in really handy for this type of job. You can put them on really fast and they apply plenty of pressure. Here's another vessel form being completed. Notice I've maintained that ridge back on the small end in order to be able to apply clamps as I add layer after layer. Here I'm going to do a parting tool cut, wiggling the tool to keep my curve big enough. This is, well over 1 inch deep, so you definitely don't want to build up a lot of heat, which will happen if you don't keep that curve big enough. I normally, on a ring this size, don't cut all the way through. It's just kind of tricky catching that. It's a rough surface with that glue sticking out. I like to cut it off with a saw like this. Now it's just a routine matter of, flattening that surface, getting the thickness what I want. In this case, about 1/8 of an inch. Just cleaning this up, getting it ready for the next layer of veneer. As I've shown before, I use pencil marks with my sanding block. Just a quick swipe there to see if it is flat. Now here's the piece I cut off. I can go back on my screw chuck, flatten that, do the pencil mark, sanding block routine, get this ready for another piece of veneer. My completed top ring assembly consisted of a layer of maple, a ring of veneer, a layer of maple, 2 rings of veneer inserted or added one at a time, another layer of maple, another layer of veneer, and then a top layer of maple. It's a lot of steps to build that top ring. So all the assembly work has been done. All the layers have been stacked. The last glue joints here have actually been clamped for several weeks. I had to leave home for several weeks. They didn't need to be clamped that long, obviously. But one advantage of waiting to do my final turning is all these seams now have had lots of time for that glue to completely cure. Why is that important? Well, if you rush the project, if you do your last glue joint and go right into turning and sanding and applying finish, you're going to have moisture in there which cause that wood to swell. And if you rush it before that wood is totally stabilized with the glue completely cured, the wood will shrink after you've finished the project, and it will leave what sometimes people refer to as a glue creep, a little ridge. Well, it's not really glue creep, it's the wood shrinking back to its original form, leaving a tiny bit of glue out there on the surface. So letting this cure, stabilize, completely dry out, if you will, for a couple of weeks is really a good thing. You don't have to wait a couple of weeks, but I recommend any project, any vessel, any big glue up, before you do the last sanding, before you start putting finish on, let it cure for at least a week. That'll save you the hassle of going back and removing those little glue ridges that sometimes occur. Next step, I'm going to put these on the lathe and start playing with the shape, get the final shape and sand them and put finish on them, and then we'll go after that and cut them apart and actually build the shelf units. So here's one of my vessel forms. I'm going to take advantage of that plate of MDF which is already in place from the last glue job. That gives me a little more stability during this turning. At first it's just rough turning, getting everything smooth, getting rid of all the glue that's squeezed out, just trying to get a relatively smooth surface. On the inside, again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time there. It'll be pretty rough inside, but nobody's ever going to see the inside. I'm just getting it to a rough, even wall thickness. On the outside, I'll keep massaging that curve, trying to get it as smooth and as, defect-free as possible. I'll inspect and do a little more shear scraping, back and forth, until I'm relatively satisfied. Now I'm going to put on sanding sealer. I have not sanded this yet. I'm using wax-free sanding sealer. I'll put a liberal coat on there. I'll also put a liberal coat of sanding sealer on the inside. I like to do the same to both sides of any vessel, inside and outside. After that's dried, takes probably no more than 20-30 minutes, another shear scraping. I'm taking most of that sanding sealer off. Very light shear scraping. I'll just do this over and over. Take all the sanding sealer off, inspect, put another coat on, take it off again. I'll do this probably about at least 3 times. After all that shear scraping, taking that sanding sealer off 3 times, I should have pretty smooth surfaces. Surfaces that I can start sanding with sanding paper no coarser than about 220. After sanding up through the grits to 400, it's a matter of getting the surfaces nice and clean. An air hose followed by a tack cloth does that job pretty well. I'm going to use Minwax wipe-on poly finish. I'm going to use probably 2 or 3 coats of this gloss, and I'll wipe it down with 4/0 steel wool in between coats, and then my final coat I'll put the Minwax satin finish on, just to make it a little softer finish. I recommend not putting multiple coats of satin. You'll get a better looking finish with multiple coats of gloss covered with 1 coat of satin. Here I'm preparing boards. These will be the actual shelves that will be inserted.